The Fire of the Skies. Note: whilst featuring Himeji Castle, a historical site of great significance in Japanese culture, as a backdrop, all events and characters featured are fictitious and not based on anyone in particular. Some liberties have been taken with historical accuracy for the purposes of the story, and because I only had about 10 minutes for research, I think I also need to learn a little bit more about tactics in feudal Japan. But anyway. Nagamishi had been waiting for the approach of Iyasu's army all day. Whilst others bristled with fear at the prospect of fighting such a legendary commander, he felt a fire in his belly. He wanted to confront this legend and commit him to the annals of history. His scouts had brought word of their arrival at noon, a force of some 10,000 men, either enslaved or indoctrinated into Iyasu's forces. A cult had formed around him, where they had been promised both great earthly and heavenly reward for their service to him. They had begun to call him their Lord of Destiny. Nagamishi knew the truth, though. The man was a fraud. There would be no gold or divine praise. There would be blood and steel. There would be death. He sent more scouts to assess his foe's capabilities. He needed to know as much as possible to form a cohesive strategy. He had studied their incursions across the land. They had favoured arrows over the rifle, rejecting the Portuguese and their technology. It seemed they would rather lack an advantage than embrace a foreign innovation. As Nagamishi assessed the keep, he shook his head in frustration. If Iyasu thought that this was an honourable act, he would need reminding that honour was, most of all, found in victory. In the Daitenchu, main keep, his lord Hideyoshi resided with his family. At 82 years upon the earth, he was not to be found in battle, and, with no sons, there was none to go in his stead. As Nagamishi entered, there was a tension in the air. Lowering himself to one knee and bowing respectfully to his master, he brought word. "My lord," every word filled with reverence and admiration, "Iyasu's forces camp nearby. They number some 10,000 men. They continue to forsake Tanegashima, a form of Portuguese matchlock, and prepare devices to breach our walls." He took a deep breath and looked into the eyes of his lord. "But they will not." Hideyoshi moved forward in his chair. A Tanto sat on his lap. His frail, liver-spotted hands gripped the arms, and defiance was etched across his face. "Nagamishi, whilst the fruit of sons did not grow from my family tree, fate sought to bring me one. Anyway, defend us against these fanatics, protect our people, our family, repel these forces, and reap from them a terrible payment in blood, so that such demons never bring death to our lands ever again." Nagamishi felt a great swell of pride as he left. He had seen the blade in his lord's care. The pleading of his wife to embrace poison should the castle fall, utterly rejected. He had such honour and respect that it coursed through every man who served him. Though age had robbed him of much, it had not taken his warrior's heart. The scouts returned just over an hour later. The information they carried was detailed. They had assessed their quantity of horses, the number of bowmen, and even the general health of the soldiers. They were not all trained. Many were peasants. Few true samurai resided amongst their number, but that number was vast. 10,000 men. Here he had but a fifth of that number. He would have to lure them up the hill. He would use the Himeyama to his advantage. He would wipe away this stain. Along the length of the walls, he placed riflemen at many of the loopholes, ready to defend should his forces fall back. Many of the older men, only trained in the ways of the bow, also offered their strength to his force. Nagamishi would not reject their help, nor wound their honour by having them cower in one of the towers. No, these men would be warriors again. Beyond the walls, he began to examine the landscape further, seeing whether his tasks were being carried out as instructed. No sane man would defy him. There, with axes and spades, they toiled in secret. Satisfaction rose within him. He would be ready. All of them would be. He gripped the hilt of his sword tightly and took a deep breath. The cold winter air filled his lungs. Were he to die tonight, he could not think of a better place. Night fell. Torches were lit, and under the half-moon, Nagamishi assembled his forces. 1,500 outside the walls, cavalry, ashigaru with rifles, bowmen, samurai, and his beloved foot soldiers. Inside, amongst the 500 or so, he had placed guards at regular intervals, concentrated his rifles and bows in 3 particular locations, and secreted men in the keep's mushakakushi, warrior hiding places, and placed an elite guard about Lord Hideyoshi. As he sat astride his horse, he knew he was ready. Ieyasu was coming, and he would quell his insanity. Order would be restored, and the merchant of lies would perish. Then, as they slipped into the depth of night, torches lit the land. 10,000 men were coming for his blood. Nagamishi's men were well trained, disciplined, and of unwavering loyalty, but even he could sense the apprehension as they stared down at the bloated forces of Ieyasu. Their uniform motion like one great oil machine coming to grind them into dust beneath them. Nagamishi let out a slow and sustained breath, watching it coil in the air. Even beneath his layers of armor, the cold pierced his flesh and settled in his bones. Tonight, he would be warm in the blood of his enemies. As the marching hordes neared, the skilled archers prepared themselves, ready to unleash hell upon them all. Those with rifles, from the trained soldier to the uninitiated who had volunteered, all loaded their weapons and waited. Nagamishi thanked the gods that the air had not made their powders damp. His plans depended on those riflemen. Closer and closer Ieyasu's forces marched. The torches hovered upon the silk canvas of night, omens of the death to come. Further in they came, a shimmering form beneath the flames, and there, somewhere, Ieyasu, who had luxuriated in victory for far too long. Tonight, he would be stopped. Further still they approached, individual forms beginning to reveal themselves. At the fore, many of the least skilled of the fighters, men who looked no better than farmers and other commoners. Peasants filled these ranks, unskilled, undisciplined, merely there to swell the numbers, to dull his blade before he could strike at the heart of their force. They were to be disappointed. They could see their faces now, anonymous shapes in a sea of destructive fanatics. "Ball!" he commanded in a fluid, uniform motion. The archers pulled back their bows and waited for the order. Just a few more seconds. "Fire!" A hail of arrows was launched downhill at the enemy forces, their barbs piercing the unarmored men, tearing flesh, nicking bone, piercing organs. Men tumbled to the ground, bleeding, screaming, frantically reaching up to others for help, but the force marched on over the bodies of the fallen. The bowmen loosed another volley, skewering more of the fodder Ieyasu had offered up to their arrows. But then, as the archers prepared their next attack, enemy archers emerged from between the next row of fighters, their arrows lit with the fires of hell. The first volley came raining down upon Nagamishi's men, the armored forced to pull flaming arrows from themselves. Oil slicked the arrows and fueled the flames. Patches of the grass beneath them burst into flame. Some of their archers fell, others carrying slices to their arms and legs. The hail became incessant. Ieyasu was rotating his archers as though they were riflemen, a constant yet more scattered bombardment. Nagamishi kept his men calm, even if his heart was now beating a little faster. Soldiers began pouring through between the archers, who kept their positions. Behind them, hardened warriors, true samurai on horseback, the joy of battle etched onto their faces. Spears and swords clasped in their hands, their shouts filling the air. At either side of Nagamishi's forces, men waited, all grasping thick, fibrous rope. They all looked towards him for the command, but it was not given. He held a hand to stay them. The arrows kept coming, and his men returned in kind. The charging soldiers came nearer. Some wielded blades, others mere farming equipment, rage and fanaticism fueling their advance. As they neared the firing range of the rifles, the ground beneath them gave way at the center. Some 10 feet across, a giant chasm opened. Tatami mats covered with sodden earth fell apart to reveal a thin, deep pit lined with wooden spikes. Nagamishi heard the screams as some of their number fell to their doom. It did not take long for the others to realize the trap and circumvent it, but their pace was now more cautious, just as he had planned. Another few seconds, and then he signaled to his riflemen. "Riflemen, fire! Take every last one of them! He could feel the flames of battle roaring inside of him. Rotating the fire between two lines, he kept up the pressure against the advancing forces, tearing through them again and again, splintering bone, piercing lungs, tearing through their intestines. The hill was becoming littered with the deer, dead and dying. The samurai and the other cavalry were coming in hard. The speed at which they advanced stunned even Nagamishi. There was no hesitation in them, no reticence. They would embrace death as readily as anything else in life. They were utterly fearless. He could not fail but to be impressed. Coming to the spike-laden pit, the horses leapt into the air and kept advancing. He turned to his men who brandished the ropes. "Prepare yourself!" Every command given clearly in his booming voice. He raised his arm. His men tensed. "Now!" With all their might, the men pulled at the ropes and, at the fore of Nagamishi's forces, a low framework raised from the ground, its front lined with hefty spikes. The first wave of horsemen had no time to respond. The large shafts of wood knocked men from their mounts. Others shattered horses' legs and skulls. Blood ran down the wood, and the din of suffering filled the air. The men at the ropes picked up spears and charged the front of the line. The gunfire ceased, and they waited. The framework, now mangled with horses' flesh and maimed samurai, slumped down. Other horses cleared the main obstacle and began to advance. The men at the front angled their spears upward and caught several of their attackers, but some burst through the line. With the sweep of one blade, a defender was freed of his head. Blood gushed into the eyes of the man next to him, who was trampled by the approaching hooves. As more of these men fell, and as more horses began advancing up the hill, the riflemen began anew. Bullets began ripping through them, shattering bones, dislodging eyeballs, fracturing shins, fragmenting orbits and bursting the internal organs of the horses. Many collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath them, the advancing forces slipping on the thick, red liquid. Some of the samurai escaped major injury, bullets clipping off the edge of armor, arrows having missed them earlier by the breadth of a hair. Nagamishi ordered his riflemen back into the castle grounds. They would reinforce those already there, and they would ensure his plans were carried out. He and his most trusted warriors advanced towards Iyasu's samurai. Lowering himself from his steed, he drew his katana. This was how wars should be fought. Iyasu's men stood their ground. Their feet splashed with blood. The sounds of screaming men and squealing horses filled their ears. One of their samurai turned in disgust to his felled steed and slit its throat in one swift movement. It thrashed around desperately as it bled out and then fell silent. Nagamishi slapped his horse and sent it back up the hill. He, at least, valued such a fine beast. For a moment, even as another volley of Nagamishi's arrows flew overhead, they all just stared at one another. None seemed to be making the first move. Smoke filled the air. Sulphurous gunpowder tinged every breath, and time slowed. Nothing felt quite real. There was a strange peace in that moment, and some did not wish to leave. But time must continue, and Iyasu's great warriors, with a cry of rage, engaged Nagamishi and his men. There was a blinding whir of thrusts, slashes, and parries. All of these men, battle-hardened, fought on an even footing. Only the skill of Nagamishi himself stood above the others. His motions were like the calming flow of water. As a hulking swordsman made a downward slice, he merely slid to one side. A swift sideways attack then came his way. He deftly blocked it, pushed back his attacker, and then struck at the armor across his midriff. The protection held, but parts fell to the ground. Nagamishi's opponent came in with a blow of incredible force that sent a vibration right through his body. His blade had blocked the attack, but it had forced him backwards and taken him by surprise. He had to keep his concentration. Seeing his disquiet, the Hulk came in with another of his crushing blows. However, now wise to this, Nagamishi moved his blade and sidestepped this new assault. Overextending his reach, the Hulk now panicked. He flailed forwards and fought to rebalance himself. Such a foolish error, but his efforts were not in vain, and he began to correct himself. At that moment, Nagamishi delivered a swift kick to his back, and the Hulk thudded into the ground. Quickly, for a man of his size, he turned over to defend himself anew. He was met with a katana plunging through his armor and crunching through his ribs, piercing his heart. he was gone. Nagamishi's samurai were prospering against these great numbers, fighting together as a cohesive unit. Each anticipated the moves of the others. They were a frightening machine of destruction. As the enemies thinned out about them, the order was given to advance, sending confusion through them. But they would not disobey him. Thus they began to push forwards. Ieyasu, observing from the rear, saw a golden opportunity. Nagamishi was being too eager in his momentary success. Advancing, he was leaving both flanks exposed, and thus his devastating archers would be left unprotected. He sent 2 groups of his own personal guards to approach far wide and then ascend the incline from the sides, where they would devastate the bowmen. It was a brilliant opportunity. Nagamishi was waiting. Whilst he cut through scores of incompetent soldiers, he was waiting. Blood was running down the grooves on his blade and spilling over the tsuba. In that moment, he was one with the gods, feeling as though his sword were guided by a divine force. Ieyasu, however, was slow in taking the bait, and he knew his warriors could not sustain this intensity for much longer. His prayers were answered when 2 contingents of men were sent to attack his flanks. As they neared, he turned to his own men. "To the castle! All of you, to the castle!" All of his forces began a rehearsed motion and sprinted up the hill. He made a signal in the air and, at the top, just outside the walls, ropes were cut. The dam, holding back the mounds of rocks, fell and a torrent began to race down the battlefield's flanks. The advancing forces stood no chance at all. Legs were knocked out from beneath them. Further rocks came down and smashed them in their faces, breaking noses, drowning men in their own blood. Larger stones ploughed into skulls, cracking the bone and bursting the grey matter out through the gaps. Arms were twisted and shattered, ribs cracked and broken. The attackers at the flanks lay motionless, but the central forces had begun a speedy advance. Just outside the castle walls, Nagamishi and his warriors formed square and waited. There were so many coming for them, so very, very many. He looked down at them, his chest heaving from all the exertion, and was amazed that he remained on his feet. How was he going to fight them all? Their approach was relentless. They were in range. "Separate!" His force at the gate split down the middle to reveal the riflemen who had retreated. They loosed a volley of fire that tore through countless men. The second volley came, and they began to slip and stagger through the blood. "Inside now, all of you!" Nagamishi's forces poured into the castle grounds. Other soldiers began firing from the loopholes, and the volunteers began to fire arrows from further inside the complex. Nagamishi cast off his helmet and made haste to the walls. It would now be a siege. He went as high as he could and looked out. His blood ran cold. With all his tricks and traps, with all the courage and fight of his men, there were still so many. A force a size he knew he couldn't beat. Had he a weaker heart, he would succumb to despair. He had done his best, he had devised plans, unusual tactics, and had the best of men. But this was how Ieyasu won, wasn't it? So few of skill, but so many of intent. He threw swathes of men and wore his opponents down with nothing more than attrition. Then, again, in the sky, more flaming arrows. Ieyasu was going to sow panic amongst the people. The fire would cause anarchy. It would. He was stopped in his thoughts as he watched the fires in the sky. They were leaving red-hot trails of light behind them, like no arrows he had ever seen. They were actually travelling down from the very heavens themselves. He stood there in complete disbelief as they plummeted further, heading towards the very centre of the battlefield. Sweat ran down his forehead, and he looked on in amazement as a divine fire cascaded with the land, sending a wave of energy through the hillside. The ground was pommeled by this force. The grass was seared, and the noise rang out for miles around. Throughout the ranks of the enemy forces, panic took hold. Nagamishi imagined the look on Iyasu's face and smiled. The gods were on his side. 10,000 men or 100,000. They had chosen him as victor. He clasped his katana with renewed fire in his heart, ready to continue.